presentation. Marie-Benoît Magrini. Marie-Benoît Magrini is an economist working at Inra, working at the Science and Development Department. She will be presenting, giving a presentation on the construction of value of pulses. Good morning. I would like to thank the Foundation, first of all, for having me this morning. At Inra, I do research on understanding innovation in the agro-industrial industry. And I have done some research as well on, the recent year's momentum around pulses. I have done a lot of interdisciplinary work. I work with agronomists, I work with Inra nutritionists, as well as other technicians specializing in animal food. So I will give you a presentation which is very much a summary of what we've done to change things, to raise awareness and better understand the new momentum with pulses. Some of what I'm going to say has been said in previous presentations. The environment hasn't been very positive to create value for pulses. So what are some of the recent trends, and is this something we could change? I will be talking about seed pulses, but this, I suppose, could apply to vegetables in a broader way. Coming back, first of all, to the problem. And again, we heard this before, pulses have many benefits in terms of production, first of all, because they have this unique property, which is that they capture nitrogen. They don't call for additional fertilizers, including nitrogen. And one of the big, as you know, nitrogen is a big GHG contributor in France, for example. A lot of it is coming from nitrogenous fertilizers, which are being used in farming, and eventually they contribute to global warming. They also have benefits in terms of diversification. They are an opportunity to change or address the question of crop rotations. More and more what we're seeing in France is agroecology, using less phytosanitary products, and what we need is to have greater crop rotations and more crop diversity. What we are also doing at Inra is some experimental work on new crop systems. We talk about associated crops, where we have cereal and pulses being grown at the same time on the same plot of land. And what we're seeing is that with less fertilizers, you can actually increase the yield by as much as 20%. So this shows that there are opportunities for pulses. I won't come back to the nutritional benefits. We know that there are many such benefits, both for animals and for humans. All this has been captured in a recent book published by Inra and Terrinovia, looking at the existing knowledge about pulses. This book, or this research project, is available and downloadable. You can find some of my research of this presentation in that project as well. So, looking, since we are celebrating the year of pulses, an interesting focus has been put on pulses. For example, in France with the CNLS, there has been a communication campaign focusing on a younger public and explaining some of the nutritional benefits and using superheroes to encourage the younger generations to consume pulses. But the fact is that in spite of all the benefits and all the positive things, pulses are still not produced widely in France and not consumed as much. They represent less than 2% of the crop rotations, less than 2 kilograms per year and per person, which is extremely low. And most of the pulses consumed in France are imported, as much as 80%, depending on the type of pulse. What we're also seeing is that they use less and less in animal feed. I will come back to that in my presentation a bit later. And what we do see is that Europe has tried to encourage the production of pulses, including protein crops. The fact is that so far it has not been done. It has not been done very successfully. Other countries, Canada, for example, were able to change things. So the French production. We've tried to understand the French production and why there has been no real momentum and what could be done in order to change things. So we will come back to some of the key factors that could explain why this momentum hasn't happened. First of all, one of the big hurdles is the question of value, the lack of value. There's been a big survey with farmers or producers in France, and one of the number one hurdle is the lack of compensation, or at least perceived compensation compared to the benefits or the money that is generated from other crops. There is a big gap, income gap, or perceived income gap, which we have to address if we want a new momentum, a more positive momentum. So let's together try to understand what causes this gap, why there is such an income gap between cereal and other productions and pulses. So the number one factor is quite simple to understand. These pulses have an agro-environmental benefit, but today's market does not take that into consideration, which is a big concern of capitalism. Capitalism doesn't recognize the value, and therefore it doesn't translate in terms of disposable income for farmers. So what can we do in order to change the signal? Well, I think in Canada, for example, the Canadian strategy was that was used for pulses was to communicate healthy people, healthy planet, for example, in order to encourage the consumption and production of pulses. In France, very little has been done. And we've also tried to work on monetary value of pulses. And there are interesting strategies coming from cooperatives, such as In Vivo, for example, with a carbon market around pulses, and cooperatives that accept to increase pulses can actually improve their carbon emissions, and they can sell this on a carbon market with other players on the market who are willing to contribute and who are also willing to lower their carbon footprint. So these are interesting mechanisms. They are emerging. Of course, they have yet to be consolidated and improved. The second point, or the second thing, is that pulses would have a positive impact on the footprint. Now, we also need to talk about farming systems. What we are seeing today is that the interannual benefit is not understood very well by farmers or producers. To reveal the benefit, the fact that pulses require less fertilizers and actually release nitrogen, which means the next year you don't need to put as much nitrogen or less fertilizer. There's quite extensive knowledge on this. It can improve the yield of wheat with less fertilizers the next year, and it can increase the protein content. But that benefit is generally attributed to wheat, but not to pulses. Farmers do annual appraisals, not interannual appraisals of their yields. The problem is also advice received by farmers, by technical advisors. The type of the advice, the nature of the advice has not been adapted. So there is a need for better advice, and better analytical work and accounting work needs to be done by farmers to really understand the benefits. We need different advice, better advice, to better understand the value and the contributions of pulses. Let me now come back to a third factor, which is a bit more complex, and this is more for historical and economical. Over the years, as Nicolas said earlier, The environment hasn't been favorable, hasn't promoted pulses, and therefore we have never really sought to include them in our production system. Production systems were developed decades after decade and based on yields and so on. And once a choice is made, it tends to be reinforced. After World War II, the focus was put on cereal and fertilizers, and therefore cereal picked up very sharply after World War II. Here's an interesting sentence coming from Arthur, which really summarizes the theory. The technology initially is not picked because it's the best one, but it becomes the best one because it was picked. And sometimes we invest or we overinvest on a technology. So here's an interesting example of this, a good illustration. This is the difference between wheat and peas. As you can see, peas is the biggest protein crop produced in France. There is a huge gap today. We have, in the meantime, wheat picked up and has really grown, which makes it more and more difficult to produce peas. So what are some of the historical and economic mechanisms that have contributed to this gap? Again, we're back to World War II. Immediately after World War II, commercial agreements were signed between the US and Europe. Europe was going to benefit from customs benefits or rights, whereas the US would be able to export their soy to Europe, for example. And what we're seeing is husbandry picking up in Europe. And of course, this is an opportunity for American producers to sell out their soy to European meat producers. Again, we're after World War II. There's been a long period of shortage. All of a sudden, meat is back. Soy is being exported from the US to supply Europe. And back then, political leaders overlooked the long-term consequences and didn't really understand the mechanisms that eventually contributed to specializing French agriculture with a clear focus on cereal and husbandry in some areas as well, especially in the areas where ports were based. So these are the big contributors which reinforced some of these key decisions, post-war key decisions. It made more sense back then to have less species, less types of cereal, to optimize logistics, achieve economies of scale. Networks were created, and the more people or farmers adopt a specific production, cereal, for example, the more performance is likely to increase. And this is exactly what happened. Interdependencies emerged between different sectors. France became self-sufficient, Europe became self-sufficient in its cereal and wheat production in the early 80s. We became self-sufficient, and yet we are producing more and more cereal because we're now exporting, and we've consolidated know-how and knowledge in the area of cereal. When you look at human food consumption patterns, on average, we have increased the consumption of wheat. Nearly 100 kilograms per year per person versus only 2 for pulses. And again, there are some biases as well on how pulses are assessed. Most of the available knowledge is on cereal. Little knowledge about alternatives. When you have a system that works well, why turn to alternative systems when these systems receive very few investments and when very little knowledge is available? Changing becomes extremely difficult. So we had increasing yields with soy in the US and cereal, and little by little the system reinforced and became stronger and stronger, eventually leading to a lock, to a stalemate. We all know that it would make sense to introduce or reintroduce pulses, but there is this stalemate we're in. So again, it's the entire agro-food system which is in this stalemate. It's not just one sector, it's not just one part of the system, it's the entire system which needs to be modified. And of course, it's quite complex to do. Let me briefly come back to animal feed. This particular industry is important to understand why so few investments are being made in pulses. Again, after World War II, in 1973, there was a very severe drought in the US with an embargo on soy. And all of a sudden, Europeans panicked. No more soy available to feed animals. Europeans realized that we were very dependent on protein imports from the US to feed animals. And this is where Europe decided to launch its protein plan for more crops, not soy, but new crops, protein crops besides soy. The problem is that the animal feed industry really changed. The industry, it is an industry which is very much based on the substitution of raw materials. As I said, there is a big gap between cereal and pulses and the benefits for farmers. This is why the production went down. Few volumes, small volumes, which means it becomes more difficult for animal feed producers to find raw materials, which means that they went for other options. And the animal feed industry, where Europe decided to go for pulses, eventually it never became sustainable. So at the end of the day, the question is, how are pulses assessed? Well, I think, once again, the question is really value. How do we make sure that we give more value to pulses? And I believe we certainly need to look at pulses being for human consumption and not just for animal feed. Now, moving on to the second part of my presentation, now that we have a better understanding of the historical background and why this why there is this gap between cereal and pulses. What are some of the new trends? Where do we stand today? And what room is there for pulses? Again, in this context of a stalemate, which I described earlier, including a technology stalemate, which is difficult to get out of. So, a quick reminder, and again, this was mentioned earlier. What we do know is that the French tend to consume less meat. Although there is an increase of poultry consumption, white meat. Eventually, what we're thinking is that eventually we may come very close to the ANSES recommendations, which means half of the proteins would be vegetable-based, half are animal-based. Right now, that ratio is 60-40, 60 being animal, 40 being vegetable. The ANSES recommendations are 50-50. This and similar recommendations are seen in most OECD countries. So, more vegetables, we are seeing more vegetables being in food habits. But what we're seeing is the next food transition, the next big food transition. Again, we need to understand the connection between animal proteins and vegetable proteins. So the first transition happened immediately after World War II, with more and more animal protein and less vegetable protein. This transition can be observed in Asia and Africa as we are speaking. So right now we are in the middle here, but what we're now seeing is, for the very first time, a decline in animal production and a slight increase of vegetable protein. And of course, what we don't know is when this second food transition will actually occur, when the two lines will intersect. Some projections are saying 2030. So the real question is, with that transition, what role will pulses play in that transition? A few words about demographics. With aging populations in Europe and in the rest of the world, what we are seeing is that there are some increasing deficiencies in proteins, especially in older citizens. The older you get, the more deficiency we're seeing, because older people tend to consume less meat. So we need to rethink a more adapted protein-based food. Here are some interesting initiatives and trends we're seeing in France. This is an investigation or study which was carried out by CREDOC. What are people looking for today? What is driving people? As we said in previous presentations, people are questioning current production systems. Some people are willing to come back to more locally grown products, healthy products. We're seeing a real trend towards more vegetarianism, what we call flexitarianism. Many French say that, for example, once a week, they would be willing to eat no meat whatsoever. There's a veggie or veggie movement. Carrefour has now a section with veggie products only. So this is where we stand. In the rest of the world, we're seeing some interesting trends as well. Here is Barilla. Barilla has developed a new pasta, which is based both on wheat, which contain wheat, but also pulses, and it is being advertised in healthy food programs in the US. As you know, obesity is a major problem, especially with teenage populations in the US. And the authorities are encouraging the consumption of healthier food, including this type of pasta. They have been available on the US market since 2005, since last year, and Canada as well. And so there is a real fad for these new products.
Well, what we see as well is that there's another development. We know that the protein and plant markets is growing fast. Growth rate is approximately 40% in the US. At present, the biggest pension funds funded Google, Facebook, and other growing firms. Nowadays, they're moving towards the plant-based industry. They're convinced that plant proteins will be more and more important in the future, and therefore more funds are being raised in this industry. So the veggie movement is a movement that's growing fast. As I was saying, the problem for us is that we've not yet moved to the second transition. Therefore, there's a challenge for us. The challenge is to give more importance to pulses to have lasting crops. We have to look for outlets for these pulses to see if they could play an important role in the second food transition. Now let's talk about the role of institutions. What we've seen is this. I don't know why in the English-speaking world, pulses have always been seen as a source of proteins, whereas in France and elsewhere, it's considered as starchy food. I don't know. I don't know why we look at these differently. Anyway, in the English-speaking world, we see that they eat more pulses than we do, and they usually say that this can be used to replace other types of food or animal byproducts rather in Canada and in the UK. At the beginning of the year, the UK has very much focused on this. They asked people to eat more beans and dry beans so that they would diversify the protein intake. The objective is not to all be veggies, but to give more importance to pulses and beans. In France, they're considered as starchy food or beans only. There's no sign or signal sent to the consumers for them to eat more of those. They're considered just like noodles or pasta or rice. So the problem is that of the institutions, they're not giving enough importance to pulses in our diets. Now back to the other question that I mentioned before. We're in a dead end. Now look at the new products that appear on the markets. On all the Western markets, there are new products. Most of the proteins that are used as ingredients usually come from wheat and soya. And everything since the aftermath has been based on wheat and soya. How can we change this? I have a few minutes now to perhaps try and give you explanations that will be different. We look at the literature and innovation mechanisms. I'll show you two things that can be a source of inspiration for you. The first drawing is this one. This is a systemic scale drawing developed by Gilles from Denmark, presented several times to the European Commission. The objective is to understand the mechanisms of transition, that is, global societal changes. It's an easy drawing. You have the general context, environmental, economic, social, etc. The objective is aging and demographic pressure. All of this will have an impact on the production system, which is well organized and quite consistent. Consumers have their own choices, and they will be impacted as well as technologies that are being introduced, scientific paradigm as well. So it's a whole system that developed with time. What theory says is that to unlock the situation, we need to have more radical innovation. And usually, radical innovation will stem from stakeholders that are not in the existing system. The system is caught in its own paradigm, and the system itself cannot really develop things quickly enough compared to other stakeholders. This is how to read the drawing. So we have a dead end or deadlock, and we have to therefore unleash other innovations in the hands of other stakeholders to introduce a new type of system. The new system would be based on more pulses in food and diets. The other thing to remember is that the transition will take quite a while, at least between 30 to 50 years before it truly impacts society. What about these radical innovations? Where can they come from? Well, at present, literature says that most of these innovations come from towns. Towns support citizen-based initiatives. This is also very much connected to the veggie movement, very much present in Belgium. Belgium towns got together. They organized a number of events, like on Thursdays at school, at the cafeterias, in schools. The trend is to eat more plant-based diets. In France, we have similar developments. For instance, the town of Angoulême has its own charter called Bien manger, c'est l'affaire de tous. They have hired cooks who cook for children at school, and these cooks are trying to use more plant-based proteins, and they're working with the local co-ops so as to introduce more pulses. The town of Montpellier has also another diet without any animal-based proteins. So these are the new charters that are based very much on what citizens do. Not the large corporations, but mainly what citizens do, the projects that they develop that are supported by towns. And here's the last thing I want to say about innovation. This is recent literature that has not yet been developed in the agro-food business, which is that of gaming and video games. Quendi is an economist who works at Montreal, and Cohen-Dit studied a number of companies to see how they could explore individual creativity, which does not belong in the institutional networks. This is the system that he's developed. There are three levels: the upper ground, the formal world, that of companies. The informal world is the underground world, where new habits are developing and new appetites, that is, the inhabitants and the associations of city dwellers, and this is less formal than the world of companies. What he said is that we need to reconnect both worlds and therefore focus on epistemic communities to form what is called the middle ground, that is, communities that will be a source of inspiration for companies. These creative communities have been studied by Ubisoft, a French company that is also based in Montreal, that's in video games. Now it's the number 3 video game player in the world. Their management teams have changed. They ask all of their employees to attend all these citizen-based events, that is, to go to concerts, to bars, to festivals, and little by little this company has set up special events and organized special events, several festivals that are organized by this company to try and capture new ideas. And then these new ideas will have to be integrated in the company that has to produce and develop products. But it's an interesting source of inspiration. What are the middle ground experiments that are supported by the agro-food companies? Now, let's have a look at this. We will see that, unfortunately, the agro-food companies are not supporting enough these types of events, even though we have more and more events like these in France. Now, we have the street food festival, we have product competition. In Canada, a number of awards were given for pulses. There's a competition, for instance, about recipes. And in France, in Europe, there's the Ecotrophilia Awards. And recently, the awards were given to recipes that use pulses. So there are some premises. But beyond these events, what's important for companies is to keep this link between the upper ground and the underground. And I think this is a role that the agro-food companies will play. So supporting pulses is something complex. It's multidimensional. What I think is key is to focus on the institutional rules. These are the collective rules we use, but also we need to reconsider innovation to support the diets based on pulses. This is the International Year of Pulses, and last week in Dijon there were 2 days organized on pulses. All of the presentations will soon be online, and Inra has a press kit, which is available on the Inra website. This press kit is a document that focuses on pulses. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Marie-Benoît Magrini, for this very dense presentation, thanks to which we have an awful lot of information on pulses, or dry legumes, or dry beans, irrespective of the words we use in French for that. Do we have perhaps a couple of questions before the break? Yes, please, go ahead. Could you please stand up and tell us who you are? we have cameras in the room. I'm Jean-Marie Boucry. I'm an economist in the food industry. I have retired, and I've seen something in France. I've seen something in France which is that we don't talk about the industrial companies. It's strange. We don't talk about bioeconomy. The problem with pulses is that we could have talked about oilseeds, and we talked about wheat. The problem is that with these pulses, we're looking at seeds, whereas with wheat, there's starch, gluten, whereas for pulses, well, there are many historical dimensions that we've talked about, but you know, how can I say, let me rephrase. I'm an economist, but we tend to forget all the other dimensions connected to pulses. Well, we didn't have time enough today. Today, there are two technological paradigms so as to eat more pulses. Either we focus on the seed itself in traditional recipes, or we break the seed down into bits and pieces. Not many people eat the whole rice, or we eat, however, bread and pasta. Some industrial groups are working on this. Roquette, for instance, is a company that focuses both on starch and proteins. They're trying to support both, and at present there's work done by Inra on how we break down these seeds. A platform called Improve developed in the northern part of France, in Picardy. They're trying to develop technological tips, and what I called the plant protein matter is this. That is, it's either flour or dry processes, damp processes to separate the different ingredients. The objective today is to do what we did with grains to pulses. This is what some industrial groups are doing at present. Thank you very much. An interesting topic indeed. Now we have another question, I think, here, or perhaps a remark. Two questions. We don't have much time, madam. I have two questions to ask. Microalgae are developed by Group Roquette. That's something very important. The question I have is the following. There are farming subsidies. Do you think that these have impact on competitivity gap between grains and pulses? Thank you for asking the question. Interesting question indeed. When the protein plans were launched, there were subsidies, grants given to farmers, so as to offset the income gap that existed between these crops and other types of crops. But the outlets were focusing on animal feed. So at the time, the grants were given because we thought that progressively we would develop these types of crops. The problem is that we saw that animal feed is not a stable market that cannot take all of these pulses. When the CAP changed at the beginning of the 1990s, the subsidies were less stable, so there's no stability to support these crops. And also what we're doing at Inra is that we're not just thinking about animal feed for these seeds. We would also need to think about human food. And at present, there's nothing for that, no subsidies at all. Okay, very last question. I'm Michel Albertalli. I work for Roquette. We're talking about Roquette, so we're in the room. I was thinking about something. Maybe you know what the answer is. Who uses proteins in the world? I think, first and foremost, it's animals before human beings. Don't you think so? Animals eat proteins, and to my knowledge, they eat soya-based proteins and mainly grain or cereals, I think. We should mention this. Now look at protein consumption. I think that today, you know, I work as a salesperson for Roquette, and I want to get protein for human diet, but for animals, we know that this is already the case. They eat a lot of proteins. Certainly, in France, we also had agro-fuels. And for instance, sunflower, we realized that there's also omega-3 advantages, but this policy was used for animal feed. There were new products that were rich in protein, and that's why it was used very much in this sector. Okay, that's the end of the morning session. That was very interesting. We'd like to thank the